Musical Theater Heritage. Not the snappiest name ever.
But if you're looking for a success story in the arts, these are your guys.
Like the name would imply, they are mad about musical theater.
But the way they package it and the audience response to it keeps making MTH a busier and busier place.
I have the details of my 20th annual A Night on the Town radio listeners trip to New York and Broadway.
It's often said that the best way to tell a story is to start at the beginning. But since we can't take you back to Lost Falls, West Virginia, George Harder's hometown, this will have to do.
I hope that you'll join me because we're going to be seeing the game-changing musical theater piece.
It's the studios of Kansas Public Radio, where Harder records A Night on the Town, a loving look at Broadway musicals he's been broadcasting for 35 years.
Other people are holding out rock and roll and jazz as indigenous American musical art forms, but nobody was really holding out the American musical as an American art form. I will be there with you as your host and guide. That's where I felt that that was my mission to do that.
There is nothing like a day.
But this isn't really a story about a radio show. It's about what sprung from it, musical theater heritage, which means a little of this and that, some more of this, and this, and this, even this, and it all tracks back to a conversation in 2003 between George, opera singer Nathan Granner, and his pal Chad Geralt.
I was thinking, George, we need to do your radio show in front of an audience. And so we decided to do Leonard Bernstein's On the Town. We had no idea what we were doing. We did it in front of 200 people, and it was magic.
Like a day.
We take a large cast musical that most people know, and we strip it down. Costumes, props, set pieces, choreography are all part of our show, but they're carefully chosen tokens rather than the rule, so that we can focus on the heart of the material, the book and the score. We get down to the nitty-gritty.
It kind of concentrates the theatricality of it. It's like a theatrical bullion cue. It's concentrated theater.
So what exactly do you call that? Some would say concert style or semi-staged. Sarah Crawford prefers to think it's morphed into musical theater heritage style.
We have our script, we put them in our hands or in music stands, and for the most part we face up and out and give it all over to the audience. But once we establish those rules, we break them. You know, I feel like I'm a strong director, and we have incredible talent here in Kansas City, but it really is the magic of the format that does that for us.
People seem to respond to it. In some ways, they find that it's more theatrical because they're using their imagination a little bit. We've actually had people walk away from some of our shows. A good example is Sweeney Todd saying, I never knew what the show was really about. I just thought it was about a woman baking Todd's victims into meat pies. But cannibalism, it is really not about that. It's really about how the thirst for revenge can consume a man's soul.
There's just nothing like it. It's in a 244-seat theater in the middle of a shopping mall. It's kind of turned into a little Lincoln Center right here at Crown Center. 9, yes, let's go.
If you're
9.
thinking you used to go to movies here, you're right. Cinemas occupied this space in Crown Center until 2008, when MTH and several other arts groups were invited in to use the newly renovated Off-Center Theater. This summer, Harder signed a deal to become sole occupant, with an understanding they'll keep the lights on substantially more nights a year. That's why, in part, their wildly successful Musical Mondays are now taking over Tuesdays, too.
I remember our first year we did it, there were 4 of them, and they were totally free for season subscribers, and we had like 40, 50 people. And here we are 7 years later, and they've been sold out for 4 straight years, and their ticket prices are the same as a ticket price to see one of our shows.
And one of our missions is to try to make it so that these great singers don't have to move to New York or Chicago or LA in order to find work.
These days, Katie Carl is a mainstay of Kansas City musical theater. In the beginning, though, she got on stage here by getting picked in the lottery on a musical Monday. It's an MTH tradition that's still going strong.
I don't know who they are most of the times. They come in, they bring their sheet music. In the middle of the event, they'll sit it down in front of Jeremy or whoever's playing piano that night, and they will sing in front of 200 people.
Nothing is for free along the way.
The audience is so supportive. It's so invigorating, and often that's the highlight of the night. It was brought to the table, maybe we should eliminate that like 3 or 4 years ago, but it was quickly rejected.
Another piece of the programming pie is waiting in his dressing room. Ben Gully joins 3 other local artists featured this year in the new A Night on the Town performance series at MTH. From opera to neo-soul tunes he writes himself, Ben's talents pour forth in this unusually intimate setting.
What Tim wanted to do when we created this thing is he wanted to turn all the lights out and make it so dark in here that we had to literally escort people in.
And the idea behind that was to create a 54 Below type of vibe, which is a very popular nightclub in New York, which is under what used to be Studio 54. It's a supper club. They serve dinner there. We don't do that here, but we wanted to create like a speakeasy type of event that would showcase the individual performers. There's no host, there's no MC, there's one performer on stage for 75 minutes just telling you their story through the music that they want to tell.
From a storytelling standpoint, naming the series after the radio show closes our circle nicely.
Afterward, eager for her opinion of those songs.
And though George Harder still waxes eloquently on stage, and even sang some in the Lerner and Lowe review, more FaceTime, he says, is not the point.
I think the most personally satisfying thing to me is when somebody like Lauren Brayton or one of the other singers who come in here will come up to me and they will say, you know, I used to listen to you on the radio when I was 8. That's how I first got interested in musical theater. And I had no idea they were out there listening, because I was by myself in the studio just playing this music. I don't want this theater company to be all about me being here and me being the main focus, because then if I'm not here, if I get killed in a fiery crash, then we don't have anything. We are seeing the revival of Cats at the London Palladium, and we're seeing a brand new play, a comedy called The Play That Went Wrong.
The greatest thing about George is that he puts people in position to succeed, and by that I mean he'll say, this is what I want you to do, I trust you to do it, go do it. And he really won't interfere. And there are not a lot of people in charge, and there are not a lot of bosses that'll do that.
No stools, just high top.
Do you ever say, oh, George, that's just enough. I can't take another detail, another bit of trivia about these things?
Every 5 minutes, man. He's got a new stat, and I don't know where he says, well, I've been reading again.
When a movie takes place in New York, look on the tables and stuff for the characters, you'll see one of these sitting around.
He's our Mark Twain of musical theater, no doubt about it.
We are growing. We are on the uprise, and that's exciting. We serve people who love musical theater, and there are a lot of people out there that love musical theater.